Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with the latest financial news from across New Zealand and around the globe. In this edition, Statistics New Zealand is about to reveal how much the economy grew in the year's first quarter. Will the figures be much worse or much better than the markets expect, with the Christchurch earthquake still haunting us? Post-quake opportunities, why one of our guests believes clean technology is a way to go with a new solar power funding scheme. And could Italy be the next European country to sink into a debt crisis? Mamma mia, what's up with the lira? All this and much, much more coming up. But first, here to tell us about the latest market developments and commodity news from around the globe is ASB rural economist James Shortall. James, great to have you on the show.
Always good to be here.
How are the markets doing? Not so well.
Yeah, markets have been pretty poor the last few days, but they have picked up a little bit on Wednesday, and quite mixed. But US markets particularly have been really weak over the past few days.
They have been. Now we've got some really bad news again over unemployment figures out of the US. What's the latest?
Well, jobs growth out of the US was weak, and even the last couple of months they revised those figures, so it's looking even worse, sort of historically. So unemployment rate now up to 9.2%, and in my eyes that really does confirm that the US is really going through a bit of a soft patch, and things aren't looking that sharp. And
couple that now with ongoing bad news coming out of Europe, and Italy, of course, is the next country that looks like it could be in big trouble. Well,
yeah, I mean, we've got Greece, all the focus has been on Greece, are still arguing about how that's really going to work and whether someone's going to have to, lose a bit of money out of that area. But then the focus now, that was always a risk, and that's why the Europeans have been trying to contain the issues in Greece, because it could move to other countries like Italy, like Portugal, like Ireland, and now it has moved to Italy, and they've been seeing a few issues, and that problem is much bigger.
Of course, because Italy is the third biggest economy in the Eurozone.
Yeah, G7 nation. I mean, reading some of the figures, then, their debt figures. You've got that Greece is around 350 billion versus Italy, that's 1.6 trillion. So, if they were to start defaulting on some of their debt, it starts escalating, then that's a big problem, and one that perhaps the Europeans just can't get their way out of.
Yeah. So who are the bond hawks targeting right now when you look at Europe?
Well, they have really been focusing on Italy, on Greece, on Spain. It's been interesting that their bond yield. So this is basically the money that the government's got to pay when they're raising money. It has an impact on their interest rates, all those sorts of things. That's been lifting remarkably over the past few days. But actually, they did raise money overnight, and still investors are prepared to give them the money, which is good news. Perhaps it's not quite as bad as we thought.
Yeah, and meantime, here in New Zealand, the Kiwi dollar's stuck in the middle of it all.
Well, Kiwi's been really strong. Trading up to an all-time high last week.
Some are saying it could go to 86 before we know it. Do you think it could go that high?
Oh, definitely. I wouldn't be surprised at all. I mean, what we're seeing, what the drivers we're seeing. I mean, also we've got the earthquake that's in the mix. Not only are we being driven by weak US economy, issues out of Europe, high commodity prices and demand for food, but we've also had this massive earthquake with insurers pouring money into New Zealand to try and cover that.
Agricultural commodities again this week, they've steadied a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's been interesting. Last week we talked about wheat prices out of the US falling by 25% just in the month of June, and there has been further weakness, but that's probably mainly a focus of what we've been seeing in other markets around the world, equities, that sort of thing. But we have actually seen overnight some of the agricultural commodities lift, corn, wheat, those sorts of products, and the US Department of Agriculture is sort of just questioning around some of the supply figures they have put out.
James, I got to ask you about the recent falls now in the dairy prices on the world market. Do you think it's going to affect payout?
You're not the only person that's asking that question, actually, because a lot of people, are worried. We've seen quite a big fall out of dairy prices, but I don't think it's going to affect payout just yet. I mean, if we continue to see prices fall, yes, we need to get concerned. But I'm still picking. Farmers are going to get about $7 in the hand for the current season. We saw this sort of thing last season as well, and we ended up having a record high payout. So, perhaps we're seeing the same this year.
Okay, I'm going to quote you on that in a couple of months' time. Thanks, James. Coming up after the break, the Australians say yes to a carbon tax here in New Zealand. What's the impact likely to be? The High Court takes action and puts a temporary halt to Cavalier's $40 million takeover of the wool scouring industry as a new bidder emerges from the mist. And should farmers be associated with ACT? Former Federated Farmers head Don Nicholson is tipped as the latest candidate from the right, the tale of the two Dons and the Yak Party. As we head to break, answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. How much will Australia's 500 worst polluters have to pay as a tax for each ton of carbon they produce, beginning next July? Find out when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much will Australia's 500 worst polluters have to pay as a tax for each ton of carbon they produce beginning next July? $23 Australian per ton of carbon, that's about $30 New Zealand. Joining us now to talk about that Aussie carbon tax that's just gotten the green light across the ditch is the editor of the National Business Review, Nevil Gibson. Nevil, you've just been in Australia. What do you make of the tax that's come through?
Well, I think when you look at Australians have a very bad view of themselves. I think they're really down the mouth and their politics are terrible and they attack each other. But if you're looking at Australia from the outside, all you can see is a big positive story. And I think this is another one. Taking this carbon tax is going to change the whole world debate on climate change and carbon emissions and get some of those talks back on the track. And a lot of countries have been looking to Australia for such a move. Carbon tax is not a bad thing in itself. It's going to emerge into an emissions trading scheme. It'll be the same as New Zealand. I don't think you can turn the clock back on these sort of things, and really it's best to be upfront about it and get on the front foot.
Well, somebody should tell the Australians, because the first polls out, of course, say that 2/3 of them hate the idea and they want the government to go to an election so they can talk about it.
Well, funny enough, they fought an election on this very issue not long ago, in which case the population was very much in favour of it, and I still think there's a large body of favour. Of course, there's big lobbies against it, but these are short-term things. You have to, but I say in the global scheme of things, Australia could show the way to South Africa, Taiwan, a number of other countries that are looking at, Korea's another.
Yeah, and it could raise the Aussie government something like, what, $24 billion in taxes. That's phenomenal.
Well, it would be good if they cleaned out all those old power stations burning coal. I think that would be good for the planet, good for the world as well.
And what should we have instead?
Well, I think these emission trading systems are here to stay, and it's just a matter of seeing how they go. And I think the fear that's been raised by a lot of the big miners is very overstated. They certainly will take a bit of a knock on their share price, but that'll be temporary and enable other people to buy in, because I don't see the Australian mining industry or the gas industry for that matter going backwards. In fact, it's probably going to double in size in the next few years.
Yeah, and as we've seen in Japan, nuclear power is definitely not wanted in many countries of the world.
And that, of course, was the saviour of the carbon emissions, because even a lot of Greens were in favour of nuclear power, but now Germany said no, and that's a huge one. You've got to look to a country like Germany where they are doing clean tech, power generation. They're way ahead in technology, and Australia could catch up to Germany in this case.
What do you think it's going to mean here now for our government when it comes to talking about carbon taxes of this kind for our industries, James?
Well, I mean, we've got an emissions trading scheme, so we're already in front of where the Australians are going to be. And they're looking at their emissions trading scheme is going to come into place in 2015.
That's right.
And you know, we've already had a lot of this in place for 12 months now for a lot of industries. So we are, you know, already, you know, a couple of steps in front of them. I mean, we've got a more encompassing emissions trading scheme, but I guess it does support some of the things that the governments here in New Zealand. I mean, we've had both National and Labor supporting an emissions trading scheme of some sort. So I guess it does support their views and what they have put in place.
But over in Australia, of course, the agricultural industry is not going to be carbon taxed by any means. A little bit different here.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got half of our you know, emissions come from agriculture. In Australia, it's only about 15%. So quite different dynamics. I mean, we've talked about the, you know, the mining industry. That's their agriculture, and that's what they're focusing on. And it's the same here. I mean, we've got a all-encompassing emissions trading scheme, which is totally different to all other areas around the world.
But the science for controlling coal emissions from coal generation power are much easier than those for agriculture. We can't really do much about the agricultural one at this point, but coal's a different story altogether.
Federated Farmers, of course, still arguing strongly that livestock emissions should never be included. What's your take on that?
Well, I think as I say, there's a lot of science to go under the bridge before anything happens, and you know, that scheme will not come in according to the government, if no one else brings agriculture into their schemes. So it's on hold, really.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a number of presentations around the country over the last 12 months, and I've included pieces about the emissions trading scheme. This is such a sore topic. That's of any topic that I could pick. Then this is it's just farmers are really get their back up. And
and let's face it, we're the only country outside of Europe that has an ETS.
Yes, that's right. But we have to. Right now, it's happening. I guess the things that I've always said to farmers are that it is happening. We've got to start making some gains. The government is covering 90% of the emissions from 2015, so that liability is relatively small. But there's no reason why I can't continue to lobby, because, as you say, we are the only country that involves agriculture.
Do we still want to lead the world in this, Nevil?
I think it's no bad thing leading the world in some ways, but those caveats are in there. So I don't think anything dire is really going to happen from it. And as far as the power generation goes, well, we're way ahead of the world in low emissions.
Now let's talk about that, because you've just come back from Nelson talking to business people there, and you're telling them that they should be going with clean technology. Tell us more.
Well, I think there's two things about that. One is saving energy, that kind of thing, and Nelson is certainly taking a lead with the financing of solar power and doing it through rates. So it costs about $6,000 to do a house. That's just the thermal side of solar power. The real gains in solar power come when you use photovoltaic batteries, which is converting solar power directly to electricity, but that's not going to be happening in New Zealand anytime soon, I don't think. But going back to the Canterbury earthquake, you're going to be building a lot of buildings in Christchurch, and for the first time, people who are building smart buildings, clean tech, we're going to have a huge domestic base in which a whole lot of new companies can develop. And I told the people in Nelson that that's what they should be looking at. Everything from lighting, energy use, design of new materials and that sort of thing. For the first time, we can be really high tech and have a good domestic base of several billions of dollars worth of buildings being built in one place at one time.
When it comes to farmers, how au fait are they, if you like, James, do you think, with this new kind of solar power, wind power, when it comes to fueling their farms?
A lot of these things, it just makes sense in my eyes, because it saves you money. I mean, it saves you money on electricity, on heating your water, on using less water in your sheds and all that sort of thing. I think farmers are playing around the sides of a lot of the and looking at ways that they can become more efficient. But until they really do see the gains, then they're not really willing to push the button.
And forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think around the world, the people who were once so in love with wind power, if you like, the turbines that you see in Palmerston North, for example, not so popular now, not as great as people thought originally. Are we going to have to rethink this?
Well, I think one way is to actually cut energy consumption, and that can be done by various means. For example, there's a lighting company in Auckland that did out a warehouse here, a big wine warehouse, and they cut the power bill by 95%. And they say they can do that in virtually every building in New Zealand.
Talking about turning the lights out, in a way they went out for Don Nicholson recently, who stepped away from being the president of Federated Farmers, but now, lo and behold, the worst kept secret in New Zealand, he's going to be running for ACT, up against Bill English down in Clutha, Southland, I believe it is.
Well, he certainly won't be making much ground in the electoral vote.
He's a brave man, I would say.
Don, I quite like Don because he's controversial. He's a bit like a newspaper columnist, but you can never get a read on what his view might be. And he rushes from being against subsidies for some things and in favour of them for others. And I don't know if ACT can actually put up with a bit of a wild card. They've got enough going on at the moment. They need to settle down and get a coherent series of principle-based right-wing policies that are highly consistent, and I don't know if Don's going to actually, I think he might be too many cooks in that broth.
Yeah, the two Dons, it'll be interesting to see how they get along. They have a heck of a battle ahead of them. How do you think farmers in general are going to view this?
Well, I guess it is definitely a play towards the farmers. Because Don Nicholson's obviously got a bit of a farming following, and ACT's definitely playing at the probably the more extreme of the National Party, which is typically a bit of a stronghold for farmers. So definitely a play from that area, and it will be interesting to see how that does play out.
Yeah, on the emissions trading and carbon
He hates
footprint.
it. He's going to lobby hard.
That will only act as a sort of an anti-progressive party, whereas in fact its policy should be highly progressive.
Wool Equities now has come to the party, taking over the wool scouring industry in New Zealand. High Court said that the deal put together by Cavalier has got to go on hold. What do you make of it?
Well, there's been a lot of talk around this because it would effectively mean a monopoly for the industry in New Zealand, which the Commerce Commission, that's really what they're trying to ascertain, and trying to make sure that the market's still going to be a level playing field for everyone. So, they have already said that that Cavalier can take over, but over Wool Services International, but it's on hold now because there have been a few new potential bidders that have arrived. Wool Equities
is out front,
being one of those guys. So, I guess that's a good thing because it may mean we can see a market where there's a couple of players involved. But it's only time will tell. I mean, it seems like Cavalier is well established. They know what they're doing. They're probably paying a pretty good price. So who knows where things will happen down the track.
And when you look at outfits like Fonterra, Zespri, you got to say, isn't the writing on the wall?
Well, I think the real parallel would be New Zealand refining. There's only one oil refinery in New Zealand, and but it runs on a toll basis, so all the people are shareholders in it, and the interest is to get the throughput as high as possible and the cost as low as possible.
I think the key thing to point out there, you two talk about Fonterra, Zespri, they're farmer co-ops. So while they are basically have an effective monopoly over the industry or the real market power, then that is a good thing for farmers because they're able to own that. But this new the Cavalier takeover, then they're a private company. They're a public company by investors, so it's quite different dynamics. I mean, farmers will lose the control and lose their ability in the marketplace, I guess.
It would make more sense for the people in the wool industry if that's their scheme to buy shares in Cavalier, because
there you
that
go.
way they have just as much control. And being a listed company means the performance will be better than a co-op, I suggest.
Talking about performance being better, let's go over to the United States right now. Democrats and Republicans quickly running out of time to do the deal as to how they're going to address the terrible budget situation. What's the latest there?
Well, they keep on arguing, and it's taxes.
They're going nowhere.
It's taxes are coming down to it. I mean, I think the Republicans don't want increases in taxes to the wealthy, and that's their home base, I guess. So it's going to be a real interesting one. I think the interesting one for farmers here is potentially they're looking at canning some of the subsidies for the ethanol industry, which of course has a big impact on the corn industry in the US. And if they were to can that $6 billion worth of subsidies there, it would have a dramatic effect on agricultural commodities, in my view. It could potentially lower corn prices, which might be favourable for livestock and dairy around the world. So that's something to watch.
And what about the other subsidies, James? They'll have to go. I mean, Republicans could actually really force the Democrats to scrap all of those farming subsidies over time, because the savings that President Obama wants are in the trillions of dollars, which just sounds too big to be true. Yeah,
too big to be true, but very, very real. And now, of course, Italy. Neville, what's your take on Italy? How dangerous is it there at the moment?
Well, you're in danger when you look at Italy to try and work out what goes on there anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I mean, they have one of the world's leading export economies, but I don't think it's a bit like Greece. None of them pay tax, and you meddle with that system because the system works, but no one knows how it works. It's as corrupt as anything in some parts. The Prime Minister has lots of problems of his own, and people despair. So I don't think anyone's going to pull the plug on Italy, because it would create quite a big mess. But they're survivors, though. The business people there are very smart.
Well, a vote of confidence for the Italian business people. Okay,
Yeah.
You might be one of the few that says that.
Oh, the
We'll see what
Economist did
happens.
an interesting survey on it, and basically there was 5-6 of the material was all negative, and then they had this highly positive one about what all the global businesses run out of Italy, and they all do it without too much interference from the government and do very well.
Ferrari? Yeah.
Motor cars, furniture, you name it, they're in there.
Not to mention great wine and a little bit of cheese too. And the pasta's not bad either.
It's a great place to visit.
It is. Okay, gentlemen, stand by. Coming up after the break, Future Proof. Head along for the ride as our experts hit the road and tell us what they'll be tracking over the next 7 days. But first, a question for you in our Farmers Facts and Figures quiz. How much more money will Fonterra pour into trebling milk production at its Darfield site with a new dryer? The answer when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much more money will Fonterra pour into trebling milk production at its Darfield site with its new dryer? $250 million more will be pumped into the site to increase milk processing threefold to 7.5 million litres a day. And now it's time for Future Proof. What's coming up for our experts? And I know that the GDP figures for the first quarter are due out on Thursday. Neville, what are they going to reveal?
Well, I think they'll be pretty much around the market average. Otherwise, I would be not prepared to make a punt. So 0.4%, I think that's the right one, isn't it, James?
Yeah, I think the market's picking about 0.4%. We're actually picking a little bit stronger. But I suppose there's a whole lot of market talk because these numbers were supposed to come out last Thursday. They were delayed a week because they wanted to check the numbers. So the question I guess everyone's asking is, does this mean it's a much higher number, or is it a much lower number, or did the number that came out the bottom, was it something that they weren't expecting?
Information.
That's right. So I guess the question is whether it's going to be quite outside those what the market is.
Can't ignore the huge volume of exports. So that'll be pushing the figure up, and you've got to look at the oil industry as well. That these are huge contributors to GDP at the moment.
Over in Australia, Neville, Woolworths has come up with a new way of buying veggies. Tell me about it.
Well, there's a huge supermarket war going on there between Coles and Woolworths, and they're fixing prices is their latest scheme, which is mad from an economic point of view. And Woolworths came up with the idea of fixing the prices of 5 vegetables, ones like tomatoes, apples, onions, and so on. And of course, they probably could do that successfully because they could contract growers. They get the same price all year round. These prices are fixed for 12 months and are slightly lower than the market average. Of course, the veggie growers are used to selling their stuff at auction. Prices range all over the place. And fruit and veggie retailers are used to selling stuff on different price, probably week to week. So it's going to be really interesting because no one's got an answer to this, and Woolworths have gone ahead with it already.
Do you think that we'll see something like that happening here, James?
Well, it's an interesting concept. I mean, it would be good for the consumer, and I think consumers probably calling out for it. That's why Woolworths have done it. But, a lot of companies here have enough difficulty getting their hands on supply. So when the supplies are short, then that's when they're prepared to pay a higher price. So that's going to be the issue with Woolworths, I guess. If they haven't locked in those long-term contracts, supply runs out. I guess the grower's not going to want 50 cents for a kilo of onions or whatever.
No, I don't think so.
The shopper's going to get a shock too if there's an oversupply of onions, for example, and they're much cheaper down at the corner store. That's going to be interesting. And Coles are, meanwhile, they've mainly it's been in milk and that sort of thing, but eggs is another one which they can probably control the price of. But Coles is sitting on its hands at the moment.
Yeah, the milk situation in Australia hasn't been particularly successful for farmers, so you'd question whether this one will be too.
Okay, now I got to ask both of you, what about the News of the World scandal now? Rupert Murdoch has had to close down the paper over allegations that they were doing all kinds of things they shouldn't have, their reporters to get information. What's it going to do to the B-Sky-B bid, do you think, Neville?
Well, I think this is a political debate that got well out of hand in the sense that who knows what's going to happen. And the media are not used to being on the receiving end of this sort of deal. And while a lot of people have criticised tabloid journalism, the fact is that 7 million people a week read this newspaper, News of the World. They want this sort of stuff. They probably don't care how it's got. And I notice in America, hardly anyone's raising any eyebrows at all. I mean, in fact, they think this is how the media carry on. In any case, in America.
Well, it sure would be an easy way to do your job as a reporter, wouldn't it? You just buy the information. You don't even have to be any good at it.
Well, women's magazines do that here. I mean, it's not that
apparently,
that hard.
Yeah.
And I suppose, virtually every day in the newspaper there's photos from your Facebook page, as indeed, and no one seems to, the technology allows us to happen.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks to my guests, James Shortall and Nevil Gibson. We love to hear your feedback, so be sure to check out the website. And it's time to start thinking about what tribute farmers can pay to the Rugby World Cup athletes that will top what French farmers did for the Tour de France participants. All it took was a pinch of ingenuity and a paddock full of hay bales and tractors. Check it out.
Rabobank keeping their man at the front end of the pack now. This is interesting. Probably an idea taken from something we saw just a couple of days ago, and the farmers of this part of the world are doing a magnificent job.
Well, once again, the artistes, the farmers here in the Department 44, the Loire-Atlantique, have been absolutely magnificent.
Fier de vous nourrir.
Wheel isn't easy.
They're definitely doing a great job. Just to translate, fier de vous nourrir. They are proud to be feeding us.
Keep the faith and keep it real. See you next time.